The first sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong wasn't the explosion. It was the silence. Command operators at Al-Udeid Air Base stared at their screens as 6 green dots representing a coalition strike package simply vanished from the display. No mayday, no transponder squawk, just empty sky where moments before, 2 F-16s, 3 Super Hornets, and 1 A-10 Thunderbolt had been prosecuting targets against an armored column pushing toward the Euphrates crossing. The tactical frequency erupted into controlled chaos. Viper lead, this is Overwatch. Say status. Nothing. Rhino flight radio check. Static. Then cutting through the white noise like a blade, a transmission so distorted it barely registered as human. Groundhog, still up. Entire package is black. The voice belonged to Captain Nadia Volkov, call sign Groundhog, and in 17 seconds that transmission would become the most analyzed piece of audio in modern air warfare history. Because what happened next shouldn't have been possible. Nadia had earned her call sign 8 years earlier during her first combat deployment, not through glory but through mockery, while her male counterparts received aggressive animal names, Viper, Reaper, Havoc. She'd been tagged Groundhog after spending an entire mission hugging the terrain so low that her flight lead joked she was afraid of heights. The name stuck. What her squadron didn't understand then was that Nadia wasn't afraid. She was precise. She'd grown up in rural Montana, daughter of a Ukrainian immigrant mechanic who rebuilt crop dusters in a hangar that smelled of aviation fuel and old coffee. She'd learned to fly in machines held together by skill and prayer, threading canyon passes where eagles nested, understanding that altitude was a luxury and the ground was honest. It would kill you if you were careless, but it would hide you if you were smart. The A-10 wasn't a fighter jet in the traditional sense. It was a flying gun platform, ugly and slow, built around a 30mm Gatling cannon that could shred tanks like aluminum foil. Pilots called it the Warthog. It couldn't outrun anything, couldn't outclimb anything, couldn't win a dogfight against any modern aircraft. But it could take punishment that would disintegrate other planes, and in the hands of someone who understood its brutal simplicity, it could survive what nothing else could. Nadia understood. She'd logged more low-altitude combat hours in the A-10 than anyone in her generation, threading through mountains and urban corridors where surface-to-air missiles couldn't get a clean lock. She knew the aircraft's limits intimately, and more importantly, she knew where everyone else assumed those limits were. The gap between assumption and reality was where she lived. Now, 70 nautical miles inside hostile territory, that gap was all that stood between survival and becoming another name on the wall. The strike package had been textbook until it wasn't. Intelligence reported the armored column as mechanized infantry with light air defense, shoulder-fired missiles, maybe a few ZSU-23 systems, manageable threats. The real picture was something else entirely. As the package descended through 12,000 feet, Nadia's radar warning receiver lit up like a Christmas tree. Not the simple tones of man-portable systems, but the distinctive warble of advanced medium-range SAMs. Panzer S-1 systems, possibly SA-15s. Equipment that shouldn't have been there, operated by crews who knew exactly what they were doing. The trap had been set with professional precision. Viper lead never saw the missile that killed him. The SA-15 streaked up through broken cloud cover at Mach 3, proximity fuse detonating 20 feet from his cockpit. The F-16 disintegrated mid-maneuver, debris tumbling through the sky like burning confetti. Rhino 2 took fragmentation through her starboard intake, engine exploding in a cascade of turbine blades and fire. She punched out at 8,000 feet, chute blossoming white against the smoke. The remaining Hornets broke hard, dumping chaff and flares, trying to gain altitude and separation. One made it. Two didn't, caught by a second salvo that turned the afternoon sky into a corridor of smoke trails and falling metal. Nadia saw it all with the clinical detachment that comes from survival instinct overriding emotion. Her brain processed angles, speeds, threat radii. The Warthog was already low, only 4,000 feet, but that was still too high. She shoved the stick forward, diving toward the deck as her warning system screamed. A missile passed through the space she'd occupied 2 seconds earlier, missing by margins measured in meters. The A-10 groaned under the G-forces, titanium bathtub of the cockpit creaking but holding. Below, the terrain rushed up, brown hills studded with scrub vegetation, dry riverbeds cutting through rock. She leveled off at 300 feet, then 200, the ground blurring past her canopy. The targeting pod showed the enemy column spreading out, SAM systems training upward, searching. They expected her to run, to climb, to follow doctrine and escape to altitude. Instead, she turned toward them. The decision was pure Nadia Volkov, the girl who'd learned to fly in mountains where retreat meant death, and the only way out was through. Her fingers moved across the cockpit controls with muscle memory precision, arming the GAU-8 cannon. The A-10's nose held 7 barrels capable of firing 65 rounds per second, each projectile a depleted uranium penetrator designed to kill Soviet tanks. She had 1,100 rounds remaining. Against a modern integrated air defense system, it should have been suicide. "Overwatch Groundhog," she transmitted, voice steady despite the aircraft shaking around her. "Package is lost. I'm prosecuting targets and egressing low. Do not repeat, do not send QRF until I clear the zone." There was a pause, then the controller's voice, tight with stress. "Groundhog, understand you are alone and Winchester on standoff weapons. Advise you abort and egress immediately." Nadia checked her fuel. 22 minutes at current consumption. The border was 40 minutes away at safe altitude. She smiled without humor. "Overwatch, if I abort, those SAMs own this airspace. You'll lose every bird you send for the next week. I'm taking them down. Groundhog out." She killed the first Pantsir before its crew realized she was in range. The A-10 screamed over a ridgeline at 200 feet, nose dropping as she acquired the SAM system through her targeting sight. The GAU-8 roared, a sound like the universe tearing itself apart, shells streaming downrange in a solid line of destruction. The Pantsir's radar truck exploded, then its missile launcher, secondary detonations cooking off the entire vehicle in a fireball that rose hundreds of feet. Nadia banked hard left, hugging the terrain, using every depression and fold in the ground. Tracers from anti-aircraft guns stitched the sky behind her, always a fraction too slow. She was already somewhere else, repositing, mind 3 moves ahead. The enemy learned quickly. They stopped trying to track her vertically and started saturating her flight path horizontally. Walls of gunfire erupted from multiple positions, forcing her into narrower and narrower corridors. A ZSU-23 caught her tailfin with a glancing burst, punching holes through the vertical stabilizer. The A-10 shuddered but held. Hydraulic pressure dropped 15%. She compensated, adjusting her flying to account for the sluggish controls. Second Pantsir was positioned in a dry wadi, hull down with interlocking fields of fire from supporting infantry fighting vehicles. Textbook deployment. Nadia came at it from an angle they couldn't have anticipated, from below their own elevation, rising up from a river cut like a shark breaching. The cannon spoke again. 30mm rounds walked up the wadi, shredding the BMP escorts before demolishing the Pantsir's radar. The missile launcher survived, turning toward her, preparing to fire. She put her next burst directly through its control module, and the system went dark. But the cost of aggression was mounting. Her left engine had taken shrapnel, turbine temperature climbing into the yellow. Fuel was critical now, 18 minutes remaining. She destroyed 2 SAM systems and damaged 3 more, but the enemy was adapting, pulling their remaining assets into a tighter defensive posture. They were hurting her, she realized, forcing her toward a specific kill zone. Amateur hour was over. Whoever commanded this convoy knew exactly what they were doing. Groundhog Overwatch. SIGINT shows enemy communications spiking. They're coordinating for an ambush. Recommend immediate egress heading 270. Nadia scanned her displays. Heading 270 would take her northwest, toward friendlies, but also directly over the heavy concentration of remaining air defense. The long way around would burn fuel she didn't have. She was in a box, and the enemy knew it. For the first time since the ambush began, doubt crept into her mind. Not fear. Nadia had made peace with fear years ago, but the cold mathematical certainty that the equation might not balance, that skill and courage might not be enough. Then she looked down at the instrument panel at the strip of adhesive tape beside her altimeter. On it, in faded marker, was written a phrase her father used to say while maintaining impossible aircraft. "If machine still flies, mission not over." The tape had survived 8 years and 4 combat deployments. She'd never removed it. The A-10's engines were still running. She still had ammunition. The mission wasn't over. Nadia adjusted her heading, pointing the Warthog's nose toward the heart of the enemy defensive position, and dropped to 150 feet. What happened over the next 7 minutes would be dissected in military academies for years. Nadia didn't fly evasive maneuvers. She flew offensive terrain masking, using every hill and structure as both cover and weapons platform. She would pop up behind a ridgeline, engage a target with a 2-second burst, and be gone before return fire arrived. The A-10's titanium bathtub took hits that would have downed any other aircraft. 23mm rounds punched through the wings, tail, and fuselage. One round shattered her right cockpit panel, filling the cabin with glass fragments and smoke. She felt something warm on her cheek, blood, probably, but her hands never left the controls. The enemy's mistake was assuming she would try to escape. Instead, she systematically dismantled their air defense network from inside its own engagement zone, using their interlocking fields of fire against them. When she attacked from one direction, they shifted coverage, exposing positions to strikes from another angle. She exploited every gap, every moment of reorientation. The GAU-8's ammunition counter wound down, 800 rounds, 600, 400. Each burst was calculated, minimal expenditure for maximum effect. No wasted shots, no second chances. At 300 rounds remaining, she destroyed the last primary SAM system, an SA-15 that had been repositioning to cut off her escape route. The missile launcher erupted in a sympathetic detonation that sent a mushroom cloud 500 feet into the air. And then, suddenly, the sky ahead was clear. Open terrain stretched toward the border. She'd punched through. Behind her, the enemy column was in chaos, burning vehicles and scattered units trying to regroup. They'd lost their air defense umbrella. They were vulnerable. Nadia keyed her radio, voice hoarse from smoke inhalation but steady. "Overwatch, Groundhog. SAM threat is suppressed. Zone is clear for follow-on strikes. I'm egressing." The controller's response was immediate, almost urgent. Groundhog understood. "Be advised your fuel state shows critical. Vector direct to tanker heading 2905, range 60 nautical miles." 60 miles. She checked her gauges. Fuel remaining 11 minutes. Her left engine was seconds from flameout, temperature redlined, and the right was compensating, burning fuel at an unsustainable rate. The math was simple and unforgiving. She couldn't make the tanker. Nadia didn't transmit that conclusion. Instead, she said, "Overwatch copy, proceeding direct." She adjusted her heading, coaxing every ounce of efficiency from the dying A-10. The aircraft had taken punishment that should have been fatal, over 40 documented hits, 2 engines compromised, hydraulics failing, fuel system damaged. It stayed airborne through engineering, through titanium and redundant systems, and through something less tangible. The Warthog had been built to bring pilots home. It was doing its job. The left engine seized at 53 miles from the tanker, turbine disintegrating in a shower of metal fragments. The A-10 yawed hard, trying to spin. Nadia countered with rudder and aileron, fighting to keep the nose pointed west. The aircraft flew on one engine now, altitude bleeding off despite her best efforts. She descended through 6,000 feet, then 5, then 4. The numbers on the fuel gauge were effectively 0, the needles resting on empty. The right engine was running on vapor and will. "Groundhog Overwatch, tanker has you on radar. They're descending to your altitude and closing. Distance now 48 miles. 48 miles might as well have been 1,000. Nadia could feel the A-10 dying beneath her, the controls growing mushier as hydraulic pressure dropped to critical minimums. The aircraft had given everything. Now it was asking her to do the same. She scanned the ground below looking for suitable ejection terrain. Open desert, some scattered vegetation. Survivable. The ejection seat would work. Rescue forces could recover her within hours. She could punch out right now and no one would question it. She'd done the impossible already, destroyed an integrated air defense network single-handedly, saved dozens of future missions. Her duty was fulfilled. But ejection meant abandoning the A-10 to crash into hostile territory, giving the enemy intelligence gold, avionics, weapons systems, tactics. It meant failure at the final step. Nadia's hand moved toward the ejection handle, then stopped. Her father's voice echoed in memory. If machine still flies, mission not over. The right engine was still running, barely. The controls still responded, barely. The mission wasn't over. She stayed in the seat. At 42 miles from the tanker, the fuel pressure warning light began to flash. At 39 miles, the right engine began to surge, gasping on fumes. Nadia adjusted mixture and throttle, nursing it, pleading with it. The A-10 descended through 3,000 feet. The controller's voice had taken on a different quality, no longer professional distance but personal investment. Groundhog, you're almost there. 36 miles. Tanker is extending drogues and descending to 2,000 feet. They're ready for you. 2,000 feet. She was at 2,500 now, still dropping. The engine was running on memory and momentum. Nadia could see the tanker on her radar display, a green symbol crawling toward her across the screen. The gap closed with agonizing slowness, 34 miles, 32:30. Her altitude hit 2,000 feet, then 1,900. The engine surge frequency increased, each cough and sputter a countdown to silence. At 28 miles through the canopy she saw it, a KC-135 stratotanker, enormous and graceful, descending through scattered clouds with its refueling boom extended like an outstretched hand. The most beautiful sight she'd ever seen. "Groundhog, Brickyard 24 has you visual," came a new voice, the tanker pilot, calm and professional. "You're cleared to pre-contact position. Take your time. We're not going anywhere." Taking her time was not an option. The A-10 was at 1,700 feet, the engine running on fumes and hope. Nadia lined up behind the tanker, closing the distance with precision born from hundreds of training refuelings and a handful of combat emergency hookups, but never like this. Never with a plane this damaged, systems this compromised at this altitude with zero fuel remaining. The boom operator's voice crackled. "Groundhog, you're drifting left. Recommend shallow right correction." She adjusted, fighting the yawing tendency from the dead left engine. The drogue basket swayed in the tanker's wake, turbulence, 30 feet ahead, impossibly far. The right engine coughed, nearly quit, caught again. 15 feet. 10. Nadia's world narrowed to that basket, to the micro-adjustments of stick and throttle, to the mathematics of intercept angles and closure rates. The A-10's refueling probe stretched toward the drogue like fingers reaching for salvation. 5 feet. 2. Contact. The probe slipped into the basket, the connection locked with a solid clunk that resonated through the airframe. "Groundhog is contact," Nadia transmitted, voice cracking slightly for the first time. "Request immediate fuel transfer." Fuel flowed through the hose, JP-8 filling tanks that had been dry for 30 seconds. The fuel gauge needle lifted off empty. The right engine steadied, surge frequency decreasing as it had something to burn again. Nadia held position behind the tanker, hands locked on the controls, every muscle trembling from adrenaline crash and sustained tension. She'd been in combat engagement for 43 minutes. It felt like years. The boom operator's voice was gentle. "Groundhog, you're taking fuel. Burn rate looks good. How are you doing up there?" The question was professional concern wrapped in human empathy. Nadia took a breath, tasting blood and smoke. "Brickyard, Groundhog is functional. Aircraft has sustained significant damage. One engine out, hydraulics compromised, multiple airframe hits, but we're flying." There was a pause then. "Groundhog, from what we can see from back here, the fact that you're flying at all is a miracle. You brought that bird through hell." She had. The A-10 had taken punishment that defied comprehension and stayed airborne through engineering excellence and her refusal to let it die. Together, they'd survived what nothing else could. The refueling took 8 minutes, enough fuel to make friendly territory with reserves. When the probe disconnected and she banked away from the tanker, heading for base, the sun was setting behind her. The sky ahead was darkening, scattered stars beginning to appear. Nadia let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Overwatch groundhog proceeding to recovery base. Request emergency equipment standing by. This aircraft will need a very gentle landing. The controller responded immediately. Groundhog emergency equipment is rolling. Full crash crew standing by. Approach is clear, winds are calm, bring her home. Home. The word carried weight. Nadia descended through the evening sky, the damaged A-10 responding to her inputs with the sluggishness of exhaustion. They'd earned their rest, both of them. When Al-Udeid appeared on the horizon 30 minutes later, the base looked like a small city of lights against the desert darkness. Nadia entered the landing pattern at 500 feet, gear down and locked. Miraculously, the landing gear had survived undamaged. Flaps extended partially, hydraulics groaning. The runway stretched ahead, emergency vehicles lined along both sides, red and white lights flashing. She crossed the threshold at precisely calculated speed, compensating for the dead engine and damaged flight surfaces. The main gear touched with a chirp of rubber on concrete, nose gear following. She deployed the drag chute, applied brakes carefully, and the A-10 rolled to a stop halfway down the runway. Silence. The right engine spooled down, its work finally complete. Nadia sat in the cockpit, hands still on the controls, breathing. Around her, the aircraft creaked and settled, metal cooling systems powering down. Through the shattered canopy panel, warm desert air flowed in, carrying the smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid. She was alive. Against every reasonable probability, she was alive. The ground crew arrived within seconds, ladders against the fuselage, hands helping her from the cockpit. Her legs almost gave out when her boots hit the tarmac, adrenaline withdrawal and muscle exhaustion combining. A medic steadied her, checking her pupils with a flashlight, knotting the blood on her face. "Ma'am, we need to get you checked out." Nadia waved him off, turning to look at the A-10. In the harsh lights of the emergency vehicles, the damage was shocking. The aircraft looked like it had flown through a metal storm. Holes punctured wings and fuselage. The left engine was a ruined mass of torn metal. The tail surfaces were shredded. That it had flown at all seemed impossible. That it had fought and won seemed like a myth. The maintenance chief approached, a grizzled tech sergeant with 30 years of A-10 experience. He walked slowly around the aircraft, examining each wound, his expression moving from professional assessment to something approaching awe. Finally, he looked at Nadia and said simply, "Captain, I've been working hogs my entire career. I've seen them come back from bad situations. But this," he gestured at the aircraft, "this shouldn't have made it. The fact that you flew it through combat, engaged multiple targets and brought it home is—" He paused, searching for words. "It's going in the history books, this specific aircraft, this specific mission." Nadia nodded slowly, too tired for words. A colonel approached her squadron commander, who must have driven from the main base the moment her landing was confirmed. He looked at her, at the aircraft, back to her. "Captain Volkov, I need a full debrief, but first, are you injured?" She touched her cheek where the blood had dried. "Glass fragments, sir, minor. The aircraft took the real beating." The colonel's expression was unreadable. "Captain, you were ordered to abort an egress. You engaged anyway. You took unacceptable risks with both yourself and a multi-million-dollar aircraft." Nadia straightened, preparing for the reprimand she probably deserved. But the colonel continued, "You also single-handedly destroyed the most sophisticated air defense network we've encountered in this theater, saved multiple future missions, and demonstrated piloting skill that—" He stopped, and something that might have been a smile crossed his face. "You demonstrated why we still fly the A-10, and why we're damn glad you're on our side. Well done, Groundhog. Well done." The debriefing lasted 6 hours. Intelligence officers pored over her gun camera footage, radar warning receiver logs, and tactical decisions. Each engagement was analyzed, each maneuver dissected. The enemy force she'd faced was identified as an elite unit equipped with export-model Russian SAM systems, operated by experienced crews. On paper, a single A-10 against that defensive network should have resulted in immediate loss of aircraft. The analysts kept returning to the same questions. How did you survive the initial ambush? How did you engage from inside their engagement zone? How did you maintain offensive operations with critical systems damaged? Nadia's answers were technical and precise, explaining terrain masking, attack geometry, and weapons employment. But the real answer was simpler and harder to articulate. She'd survived because she understood the A-10 in a way that transcended training, knew its capabilities and limitations so intimately that she could operate in the margins where others couldn't follow. She'd survived because she'd refused to accept that survival wasn't possible. And she'd survived because sometimes, when skill and courage and desperation combine, impossible becomes merely improbable. The intelligence colonel reviewing the footage finally leaned back in his chair. "Captain, I'm going to be frank. This mission is going to be studied for decades. The tactics you employed, the damage you sustained and overcame, it's textbook material. Future pilots will learn from what you did today." He paused. "But it's also going to be controversial. You violated orders. You took risks that, frankly, we can't officially endorse. Do you understand that?" Nadia met his eyes steadily. "Yes, sir, I understand, and I'd do it again." The colonel nodded slowly. "I believe you would. That's what concerns me, and why you're exactly the kind of pilot we need." The contradiction hung in the air, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, the tension between following doctrine and surviving reality, between acceptable risk and necessary courage. Over the following weeks, Nadia's mission rippled through the military aviation community. The gun camera footage was classified, but the story spread anyway, the way legends do, through whispered conversations in ready rooms, through respectful nods from senior pilots, through the changed way people looked at her when she entered a room. The mockery that had originally created her call sign evaporated, replaced by something more substantial. Groundhog was no longer a joke about flying low. It was a statement about surviving what others couldn't, about intimate knowledge of terrain and tactics, about refusing to be broken. Her squadron mates, who'd once barely acknowledged her, began seeking her advice on low-altitude tactics. Younger pilots asked questions about decision-making under fire. The women in the squadron, previously isolated by male-dominated culture, found themselves with an undeniable example that skill transcended gender. Nadia didn't seek the attention and remained uncomfortable with hero worship, but she recognized the responsibility that came with survival. Every conversation, every debrief, every shared lesson was an investment in keeping other pilots alive. The damaged A-10, tail number 790148, was transported back to the United States for evaluation. Engineers swarmed over it, documenting every hit, every system failure, every miracle of continued operation. The aircraft became a test case for survivability analysis, its wounds mapped and studied. But it also became something more, a symbol. Photos of the battle-damaged Warthog circulated through military and aviation communities, each puncture and tear a testament to combat resilience. Eventually, after months of analysis, the aircraft was deemed repairable. The restoration would take years, but the Air Force decided it would fly again. Nadia returned to routine flight operations, but routine had changed. Every mission carried the weight of that day over the Euphrates, the knowledge that she'd been tested at the edge and hadn't broken. Her flying became even more precise, her decision-making sharper. She'd looked into the mathematics of death and found variables that could be adjusted, probabilities that could be shifted. It made her both more cautious and more confident. Cautious because she knew how quickly things could collapse. Confident because she knew what could be survived with skill and determination. 6 months after the mission, she was summoned to a ceremony she hadn't expected. The Distinguished Flying Cross, the nation's highest aviation combat award, for extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight under enemy fire. The citation described her actions with clinical precision, but the medal represented something beyond tactics and results. It represented recognition that sometimes the book needs to be rewritten, that doctrine serves the mission rather than the reverse, that courage without recklessness is the hardest balance to strike. Standing at attention as the medal was pinned to her uniform, Nadia thought about the young woman who'd first climbed into an A-10 cockpit 8 years earlier, nervous and determined to prove herself. That woman had wanted respect earned through perfect execution of standard procedures. She'd wanted to fit in, to be accepted, to be seen as capable. The woman she'd become wanted something different, to be effective, to bring people home, to survive so she could teach others to survive. The transformation hadn't been planned or comfortable. It had been forced by fire and altitude and empty fuel tanks, by decisions made in seconds that shaped years. After the ceremony, as she removed the dress uniform and returned to flight suits and routine, Nadia found a message waiting in her mailbox. A handwritten note from the boom operator who'd refueled her during the emergency. It said simply, "Groundhog, you showed us what's possible when someone refuses to quit. That tanker crew tells your story to every new boom operator. You're teaching people you've never met. Thank you for not ejecting. Thank you for bringing that bird home. You proved what we all hope is true, that skill and courage matter, that training and determination can overcome impossible odds. Keep flying. Keep teaching. The sky needs more pilots like you." Nadia folded the note carefully and placed it in her locker, next to the strip of tape from her instrument panel. If machine still flies, mission not over. Her father's words had carried her through the worst moment of her life. Now they carried a broader meaning, that as long as she could fly, as long as she could share what she'd learned, the mission of making aviation safer and pilots more capable continued. It wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about the practical work of survival, repeated daily, refined constantly, passed forward generously. The A-10 that had saved her life flew again 2 years later, fully restored, tail number 790148 gleaming in the desert sun. Nadia was there for its first post-restoration flight, watching from the flight line as another pilot took it through its paces. The aircraft flew beautifully, all systems nominal, no trace of the wounds it had endured except in maintenance logs and historical documentation. But Nadia knew the truth. Those scars were still there, invisible but real, woven into the airframe's story. Every pilot who flew that aircraft would inherit part of her mission, whether they knew it or not. She continued flying, continued teaching, continued refining the balance between aggression and prudence that defined her approach to combat aviation. Young pilots rotated through the squadron, learned her tactics, absorbed her lessons, and deployed with slightly better odds of coming home. The YouTube generation discovered her story through documentaries and analysis videos, animating her mission with dramatic recreations and reverent narration. The details got embellished sometimes. Heroic myth-making tended toward exaggeration, but the core remained true. One pilot, one damaged aircraft, one impossible mission accomplished through skill and refusal to accept defeat. Years passed. Nadia made major, then lieutenant colonel. Her combat missions accumulated, each one professional and competent, none quite matching the intensity of that day over the Euphrates. She didn't chase glory, she'd already found it, or it had found her. Instead, she focused on the unglamorous work of operational improvement, of making systems better, of ensuring that the institutional knowledge she'd gained through survival didn't die with her. She wrote tactics manuals, taught advanced courses, mentored young women entering aviation with the same determination she'd once brought. The A-10 fleet aged but endured, constantly threatened with retirement but perpetually reprieved by its unique capabilities. Nadia became one of the aircraft's most effective advocates, not through politics but through demonstrated expertise. When budget analysts questioned the Warthog's relevance in modern combat, she could point to mission results, to survivability data, to the reality that sometimes you needed an aircraft that could absorb punishment and still complete the mission. Her advocacy wasn't emotional. It was mathematical, tactical, undeniable. The A-10 survived budget cuts partly because pilots like Nadia proved its worth every day. Eventually, inevitably, she received orders to a staff position, the military's way of leveraging experienced officers in planning and leadership roles. She resisted initially, wanting to stay in the cockpit, but understood the logic. Her value wasn't just in her own flying anymore. It was in shaping the culture and doctrine that would guide the next generation. She accepted the assignment and traded her flight suit for an office, her stick and throttle for keyboards and briefings. The transition was jarring, but she approached it with the same methodical precision she'd applied to flying, learning the terrain, identifying the threats, finding paths through complexity. In her new role, she discovered power of a different kind, not the visceral immediacy of combat aviation, but the slow, patient influence of institutional change. She pushed for better training standards, for realistic scenario design that didn't soften edges or avoid difficult truths. She fought against risk-averse cultures that prioritized perfect safety records over combat effectiveness. She reminded rooms full of senior officers that the purpose of aviation wasn't to accumulate flight hours safely. It was to accomplish missions that mattered, even when those missions were dangerous. The arguments weren't always popular, but they were respected because everyone knew she'd earned the right to speak hard truths. Her call sign followed her even into staff work. Email signatures read LT Call Nadia Volkov, USAF Groundhog, and the parenthetical carried weight. It was a reminder shorthand for a specific kind of competence and courage, a signal that this officer understood reality in ways that only combat could teach. Young officers sought her mentorship not because she was famous, but because she was real, someone who'd survived chaos and emerged with lessons worth learning. She gave her time generously, answering questions with patience, sharing failures as well as successes, emphasizing that heroism wasn't about fearlessness, but about functioning effectively while afraid. The documentary makers eventually found her, requesting interviews for yet another examination of her famous mission. She agreed reluctantly, on the condition that the focus be on the aircraft and the maintainers and the system, not just her individual actions. The resulting film was better than most, serious, technically accurate, avoiding melodrama while still capturing the emotional truth of that day. When she watched the finished product, narrated with dramatic intensity over reconstructed footage and cockpit audio, she felt disconnected from it. That person on screen, making those decisions, surviving those odds, it felt like someone else. But she understood the value of the story beyond her own experience. If it inspired one young pilot to train harder, to study deeper, to refuse to quit when everything went wrong, then the discomfort of publicity was worthwhile. The film went viral in military and aviation circles, accumulating millions of views. Comment sections filled with analysis, respect, and occasionally predictable controversy. Some questioned her decisions, called her reckless, suggested that luck not skill had saved her. Nadia never responded to the criticism. She didn't need to. The mission results spoke clearly enough, and the respect of people who actually understood combat aviation mattered more than internet arguments. The noise faded, as it always did, leaving the core truth undisturbed. She had faced impossible circumstances and prevailed through preparation, skill, and refusal to accept defeat. In quieter moments, usually late at night in her office or early morning before the day's chaos began, Nadia would think about that flight. Not the dramatic moments captured in documentaries, but the smaller details memory preserved. The quality of light through the damaged canopy, the specific sound of the engine struggling on fumes, the weight of the control stick in her hands during the landing. Those sensory fragments felt more real than any narrative reconstruction. They were the truth underneath the story, the lived experience that no amount of retelling could fully capture. She thought about luck, too, the role of chance in survival, the missile that missed by meters, the fuel that lasted exactly long enough. The tanker crew positioned precisely where needed. How much was skill and how much was fortune? The question had no clean answer, but Nadia had developed a philosophy through experience. You couldn't control luck, but you could maximize its opportunities. Superior preparation, constant training, tactical flexibility, these created conditions where luck could help you. Pilots who relied on luck alone died. Pilots who trained relentlessly gave luck something to work with. The difference was survival. Her father died when she was a lieutenant colonel, his body worn down by years of breathing aviation fuel fumes and working too hard. She flew home to Montana for the funeral, walking through the hangar where she'd learned to fly. The crop dusters were gone now, sold or scrapped, the space empty except for tools and memories. But the smell remained, oil and avgas and old coffee, the scent of her childhood. She stood in the silent hangar and cried, finally, for the first time since that mission over the Euphrates. Not for the fear or the danger, but for the fact that her father would never know how far his lessons had carried her. That strip of tape on her instrument panel, "If machine still flies, mission not over," had been more than words. It had been a philosophy of persistence that had saved her life and shaped her career. She placed his tools carefully in storage, keeping a few pieces for herself: a torque wrench, a maintenance manual for the crop duster, a photograph of him standing beside the first plane she'd soloed. These objects became her new talismans, joining the tape strip and the metal in the collection of artifacts that defined her journey. They reminded her where she'd come from, what foundation supported everything she'd built. Aviation wasn't just her profession. It was family legacy, continuous lines stretching from her father's immigrant work ethic through her own combat missions to the students she now shaped. The line would continue after her, carried by pilots she'd taught, influenced by standards she'd set, guided by truths she'd learned in the hardest possible classroom. As she approached 20 years of service, Nadia began thinking about legacy more explicitly. What mark did she want to leave? What change could she drive that would outlast her own career? The answer crystallized during a conversation with a young female pilot struggling with imposter syndrome, feeling perpetually undermined by subtle cultural biases. Nadia recognized the pattern. She'd lived it. The difference was that her combat record had eventually forced respect that should have been granted based on competence alone. Not every woman would get that opportunity. Most would face the grinding resistance of low-level doubt, death by 1,000 small dismissals. She started an informal mentorship network, connecting female aviators across services and aircraft types. The group met virtually, sharing experiences, strategies, and support. Nadia's role was to provide perspective to show that the barriers were real but surmountable, that excellence was the best answer to bias, and that changing the system required both individual achievement and collective advocacy. The network grew organically, eventually expanding beyond gender to include anyone who felt outside the traditional military aviation culture. It became a space for honest conversation about the gap between ideal meritocracy and lived experience, about navigating institutions that were slowly evolving but still carried historical baggage. The work was exhausting and often frustrating. Progress measured in millimeters, setbacks frequent, resistance constant. But Nadia had learned patience through combat, through missions that required hour-long flights at minimum altitude, through the slow process of survival when speed would kill. Cultural change operated on similar timescales, requiring sustained pressure rather than dramatic breakthrough. She applied the same methodical approach: identify obstacles, develop tactics, execute with precision, adjust based on results, repeat. Over years, the cumulative effect became visible: more women in combat aviation roles, more inclusive training cultures, fewer casual dismissals of female competence. The change wasn't complete or universal, but it was real. Her final assignment before retirement was appropriate: a position at the Air Force Weapons School, where she could directly influence the training of the most elite combat aviators in the service. She taught advanced tactics with the authority of someone who'd tested every principle under fire. Her students, mostly men, mostly younger, listened with respect that had nothing to do with rank. They listened because she'd been where they hoped to go, survived what they feared facing, and emerged with wisdom they needed. The classroom dynamics were interesting, watching aggressive fighter pilots become humble students when confronted with genuine expertise. Nadia enjoyed the irony. In teaching, she emphasized decision-making under uncertainty more than technical flying skills. Anyone could learn to handle an aircraft in normal conditions. The test came when everything went wrong simultaneously, when the checklist didn't cover your situation, when standard procedures would get you killed. In those moments, she taught, you needed three things: deep understanding of your aircraft's capabilities, absolute clarity about mission priorities, and willingness to trust training even when instincts screamed otherwise. Combat wasn't about heroics. It was about systematic problem-solving at lethal speeds with incomplete information. The pilots who survived weren't necessarily the most talented. They were the most prepared and the least easily rattled. She incorporated her famous mission into the curriculum, not as war story but as case study. Students analyzed her decisions, identified alternatives, debated better options. The exercise was designed to show that even successful missions involved imperfect choices, trade-offs, and elements beyond pilot control. Nadia encouraged critical analysis, even when it bordered on criticism of her tactics. The point wasn't to prove she'd been perfect. It was to develop their analytical skills, to make them think deeply about the complexities of combat aviation. Some students concluded she'd been lucky. Others identified tactical brilliance. Both perspectives had merit. The mission contained multitudes. Retirement, when it came, felt both sudden and long overdue. 25 years of service, thousands of flight hours, dozens of combat missions. Her body carried the accumulated weight of high-G maneuvers and ejection seat compression, knees and back protesting more insistently each year. She could still pass the flight physical, but margins were shrinking. Better to step aside while still capable than overstay and become a liability. The military retirement system was efficient and impersonal. Process paperwork, complete medical screening, attend ceremonies, accept the flag. Then you're a civilian, identity shifting overnight from active duty officer to veteran. The transition was disorienting. For 2 decades, her life had been defined by structure, flight schedules, mission briefs, operational tempo. Civilian life offered freedom that felt like freefall. No one assigned her tasks or evaluated her performance. No missions required her unique skills. The sudden absence of purpose was more destabilizing than combat had been. She understood why many veterans struggled with civilian life. The military provided meaning and structure. Leaving meant rebuilding identity from scratch, finding new purpose without the framework that had defined adulthood. Nadia found her footing eventually, the way she'd learned to find the horizon in bad weather, incrementally, through instruments and discipline. She stayed connected to aviation through consulting work, analyzing accidents and training programs for government and private companies. She wrote occasionally, translating military lessons for civilian contexts, exploring the universal principles of decision-making under pressure. She traveled to Montana frequently, spending time in the mountains where she'd learned to fly, remembering the girl who'd started this journey. The circle felt complete but not closed. There was still work to do, still knowledge to share, still contributions to make. The A-10, her aircraft, the warthog that had carried her through hell and back, finally retired a few years after she did. The fleet dwindled as budget pressures and changing mission requirements favored newer platforms. Nadia attended the decommissioning ceremony for tail number 790148, the specific aircraft she'd flown that day. It had logged thousands of additional hours after restoration, flown by dozens of different pilots, none of whom faced quite the crucible she had. The aircraft was headed for preservation at a museum, its combat record ensuring historical significance. Standing beside it one last time, Nadia placed her hand on the titanium fuselage and whispered thanks that no one else heard. The metal was cold and inert, but memory made it alive. Twin engines roaring, cannon firing, control stick fighting in her hands. That aircraft had saved her life by refusing to die. She'd saved its life by refusing to abandon it. The exchange was fair. Years passed. The documentary about her mission remained in circulation, occasionally resurfacing when military history channels needed content. New generations discovered it, analyzing frame by frame, debating tactics, arguing about courage versus recklessness. Nadia watched her story become mythology, details shifting with each retelling, the messy reality of that day smoothed into heroic narrative. She didn't fight the process. Myths served purposes that facts couldn't. If her story inspired people to be braver, smarter, more persistent, then the simplification was worthwhile. The truth remained accessible for those who wanted it, in official records, in her detailed debrief testimony, in the analysis documents. But most people didn't want complexity. They wanted inspiration. She could provide that. In her 70s, Nadia received an invitation to speak at the Air Force Academy, addressing cadets who'd been born years after her famous mission. She almost declined. Public speaking had never been comfortable, and she doubted her relevance to a generation facing different threats and flying different aircraft. But the invitation came from a female cadet who cited Nadia as the reason she'd pursued aviation. How could she refuse that? She accepted, prepared remarks, and flew to Colorado Springs with the familiar nervousness that preceded any high-stakes performance. The auditorium was packed, hundreds of cadets in uniform, attentive and respectful. Nadia stood at the podium, looking at young faces full of potential and idealism, and felt the weight of responsibility. What she said mattered. These were future pilots, future leaders, people who would face challenges she couldn't imagine. They needed truth, not platitudes. She set aside her prepared remarks and spoke extemporaneously, from experience rather than script. She told them about fear, how it never disappeared but became manageable, how courage wasn't absence of fear but functioned despite it. She told them about preparation, how every hour of training created options when crisis arrived. She told them about failure, about the missions that didn't go perfectly, about learning from mistakes rather than hiding them. She told them about the responsibility that came with capability, how skill obligated service, how the privilege of flying military aircraft carried duties beyond personal achievement. And she told them about the aircraft, about respecting the machines that would carry them into danger, about understanding systems deeply enough to coax miracles from metal and hydraulics when survival required it. The questions afterward were sharp and thoughtful. One cadet asked if she'd ever doubted herself during the famous mission. Nadia answered honestly, "Every second. Doubt is healthy, it means you understand the stakes, but doubt can't paralyze. You acknowledge it, incorporate it into your decision-making, and act anyway. Confidence without doubt is arrogance. Doubt without action is paralysis. You need both." Another asked how she handled the psychological aftermath of combat. "Imperfectly," she said. "I talked to people I trusted. I processed it slowly. I accepted that some experiences change you permanently, and that's okay. You don't have to be unchanged. You just have to keep functioning." A female cadet stood, voice slightly uncertain. "Ma'am, did you ever feel like you had to be perfect because you were a woman? Like any mistake would be seen as representative?" Nadia paused, considering. "Yes, constantly. It's unfair and exhausting. The solution isn't to be perfect, that's impossible. The solution is to be competent and honest about limitations. If you make a mistake, own it, learn from it, and demonstrate that it won't happen again. Over time, if you're consistently good at what you do, people stop seeing gender first. They see capability. It takes longer than it should, but it happens." The speech concluded with sustained applause that felt genuine rather than obligatory. Afterward, dozens of cadets lined up to talk with her individually, asking follow-up questions, seeking advice, requesting autographs. Nadia stayed until the last cadet was satisfied, giving each conversation full attention. These young people represented the future. They'd face threats she couldn't imagine, fly aircraft she'd never touch, fight wars shaped by technologies not yet invented. But the fundamentals would remain constant: courage, competence, commitment to mission over self. If she could strengthen those fundamentals in even a few of them, the time was well spent. Driving away from the academy, mountains rising against the sunset, Nadia felt satisfaction deeper than any medal or recognition had provided. The mission, her broader mission, the one that transcended any single flight, continued. Not through her own actions anymore, but through people she'd influenced, students she'd taught, pilots who applied lessons she'd shared. The legacy wasn't really about that one impossible day over the Euphrates, although that remained the anchor point. The legacy was about persistent dedication to making aviation better, safer, more effective. It was about refusing to accept unnecessary losses, about pushing boundaries of what was considered possible, about demonstrating that excellence had no gender. In her final years, Nadia lived quietly in Montana, in a small house near where her father's hangar had stood. She still flew occasionally, small aircraft, leisurely patterns, no combat, no stress. Just the pure joy of being airborne, feeling wind and lift and the particular silence that exists above clouds. Each flight was meditation, connection to the element that had defined her life. The sky accepted her without judgment, without expectations, without demands. It was honest in ways humans couldn't be. Follow the rules and you flew, violate them and you fell. Simple physics, clean consequences. She died at 78 peacefully in her sleep. The obituaries were extensive, summarizing her career with appropriate respect and factual accuracy. The military gave her a full honor funeral, flag-draped coffin, rifle salute, taps played over mountains where she'd learned to fly. Hundreds attended, fellow pilots, students, maintainers, people she'd served with decades earlier. The service was dignified but not mournful. Nadia had lived fully, contributed meaningfully, and left the world measurably better than she'd found it. That was enough. But the story didn't end with her death. It never had been just about her. The lessons she'd taught continued propagating through students who became teachers, through tactical documents she'd authored, through cultural changes she'd helped drive. Young pilots still watched the documentary about her mission, still analyzed her decisions, still drew inspiration from her refusal to quit. The A-10 preserved in the museum stood as physical testament to survivability and determination. And somewhere, in ready rooms and briefing spaces and quiet conversations between mentor and student, people still used her call sign as shorthand for a specific kind of excellence. The intersection of skill, courage, and stubborn persistence that defined the best of military aviation. Groundhog, a name given in mockery that became a badge of honor, a reminder that flying low wasn't cowardice, it was tactical brilliance, that unconventional approaches could succeed where doctrine failed, that gender was irrelevant to competence, that aircraft and pilot together could achieve miracles when both refused to quit. The name outlived her, carrying meaning forward, inspiring people who never met her but inherited her legacy. In that sense, the mission truly never ended. As long as pilots flew dangerous skis, faced impossible situations, and needed examples of what human skill and determination could accomplish, Nadia Volkov's story would matter. The air had gone black that day over the Euphrates. Everything went wrong simultaneously. The mission should have ended in tragedy, but one pilot in one aircraft refused to accept that outcome, and through preparation, courage, and intimate understanding of her machine's capabilities, transformed certain defeat into improbable survival. The story resonated because it captured something universally human, the possibility that skill and determination can overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. That when everything fails, when all support is gone, when death seems certain, there remains one final variable: the individual's refusal to give up. Sometimes, rarely, but certainly, that refusal is enough. Nadia Volkov proved it. The proof echoes still, carried forward by everyone who learns her lesson and refuses to let it die. The sky remembers. The story continues. The mission, as always, goes on.